Hello, everyone. Kelly's Taboo Tears presents Visceral Pleasure in Extreme Cinema 3. I love bringing together folks to discuss my favorite genre of film, which is extreme cinema. And as you can tell, this has turned into an annual event. So if you would like to get involved, please email us, horrorspinsters@gmail.com. I'm Kelly from the Spinsters of Horror, and my co-host Jessica and I, who's behind the scenes, we have a monthly show called I Spit on Your Podcast, where we discuss cult, horror, and subversive cinema. I also co-host a gorecast on disturbing films with the queen of extreme, Zobo with a shotgun, and it's called Our Bloody Obsession. I created Taboo Terrors many years ago because I found myself drifting more and more towards these very intriguing, dark, disturbing, transgressive films. I found that conventional horror just wasn't exciting me anymore. So once I dove into the abyss of the extreme, I never looked back. So content and trigger warnings, folks. If you know anything about Kelly's Taboo Terrors, then I hope you know what you're getting into. But I will remind you that there will be discussions on various themes and films that might be upsetting to some viewers, such as sexual assault, violence, torture, cannibalism, and much, much more. It will be mentioned. So viewers' dismemberment is strongly advised. So I do have a wonderful bunch of guests, but today we're going to be talking about cinematic taboos, cannibalism. So in the world of extreme cinema, there are many boundaries broken and taboos explored. In this panel, we will be discussing a variety of cinematic elements that make these films unique and often disturbing. This year, we are tearing off a flesh of cannibalism. For this tissue-driven discussion, my guests and I will be talking about two films, the cannibal classic Cannibal Ferox from 1981 and the very underrated Bone Tomahawk from 2015. Speaking of these excellent guests that I have, I'm going to introduce them one by one, and we'll welcome them into the broadcast. First up is Igraine. Igraine is an Irish horror film critic, writer, and podcast host of What a Scream, with interest in Irish horror, parenthood and horror, as well as the possession genre. She is a senior contributor at both Moving Pictures Film Club and Ghouls Magazine, as well as bylines with Dread Central, Fangoria, Horrified Magazine, BFI Online, and Film in Dublin, as well as a published author in the Hear Us Scream, Voices of Horror, Volume 2. Hey, Igraine, thanks for joining.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Me too. And our next guest is Coda Ironbear. So Coda is an intersex, non-binary indie film actor. With a unique and androgynous look, Coda is open about being part of the trans community and brings to film a very non-traditional body type. Coda isn't afraid to take on roles with dark and heavy taboo subject matter, and they have faced all their projects with the determination to leave a memorable performance. You might recognize them from their roles in the Sam Hell films Love Dump and Flesh Eater X, along with the Wicked Trauma release Divide and Conquer. Starring in several horror films as the lead, and as well as having parts in several trauma entertainment films, Coda is looking to write and direct their own movie in the future. Welcome, Coda.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm pleased that you're here because I am a big fan.
Thank you so much.
Of course. So thank you so much. We do have another guest that might be joining us momentarily. Their name is Jen, so we will move on. I am your host, Kelly, like I said. So this is going to be a great panel about cannibalism. So let's just get started. So the first question I have for my panelists, my guest today is, again, we're here to talk about cinematic taboos and cannibalism. So why do you think that cannibalism is taboo? And Igraine, I'll start with you.
I guess it kind of stems back when we look at the history of almost the discovery of cannibalism. You know, Christopher Columbus did his colonialist thing and went over and told lies to Isabella of Spain about the cannibalist tribes of the indigenous Americas. And this kind of created this thing about like colonialists versus indigenous people, and we all know how that went. So I guess that has trickled down to what we call now civilized society, and it's seen as like this terrible thing. And I guess, you know, it's violence against another person. So I guess that's where the taboo comes. But it's funny because when we start looking at cannibalism into society, back in the 15th century, people were eating mummified remains of bodies and calling it medicine in the form of mummia. Even now, people are still eating placentas. Is that not a form of cannibalism?
Good point.
Right? So yeah, I guess it stems from these colonialist attitudes of civilizations and practices that kind of gave these invaders a reason to colonize. And I guess that's where the taboo kind of comes from.
Interesting. Thank you. Coda, why do you think that cannibalism is considered taboo?
A lot of the same reasons that they had mentioned earlier. A lot of it just stems from historically going back, I mean, even before Christianity, where a lot of it was viewed as pagan rituals. So as Christianity set in more, those rituals were kind of frowned upon, and that was a way to just kind of get those to stop a lot of times, as well as adverse health effects, you know, things like kuru, you know, not understanding what those were back then. You know, the more it was done under practices, and as those faded out, not really understanding what they could and couldn't eat, you know, leads to manias and things of that sort. So
interesting. It definitely makes for, I think, great cinema.
yeah, and it does.
It does. Yes. Yeah. So my next question is, you know, personally, I've seen a lot of cannibal films. I'm really interested in them, like old, new, kind of like old and then modernized or contemporary versions of it. But using cannibalism as a metaphor, or especially, you know, cannibals are seen as other. And as many of us as othered people can sometimes relate to cannibalism in films if it's used as a metaphor. So, you know, when it comes to using cannibalism as a metaphor, there's, you know, a variety of different movies out there that show it as different metaphors, like for addiction, queerness, you know, women under patriarchy, consumerism, fetishism, revenge. So what are your thoughts of, you know, using cannibalism, which is a very kind of taboo, extreme subject matter, as a metaphor for the other? You agreeing?
Well, obviously, like one of the first one that kind of comes to mind is, like I said, like the other civilizations, the other cultures, and we see that a lot with, like, you know, Cannibal Holocaust, Cannibal Ferox, which we're going to talk about. But recently, it's kind of come a bit more mainstream with how the cannibal represents the others. So we've got stuff like Raw by Julia Ducournau, where we look at it from a queer female perspective, and that kind of inherent hunger that has been trying to be, you know, suppressed, but finally comes to the foreground. We've got stuff like Robert Eggers' The Witch, and also Dumplings by Fruit Chan, where we've got these witchy women that do cannibalistic things like eating babies and eating fetuses, and they're seen as the witchy woman, and they're kind of villainized and otherized because of their cannibalism. Also stuff like Bones and All, where we see like a disenfranchised youth as the cannibal. So it's really interesting how, although there still is that cannibal as, you know, a colonialized entity, we're now beginning to see it kind of trickle down to mainstream cinema to represent other things like queerness and disenfranchised youth.
Excellent. Coda.
I'm all for it. I love the fact that it's been used more, especially in recent years. It's getting used more and more to cover subjects that I guess regular mainstream people wouldn't be exposed to, you know, such as queerness. I've been privileged enough to be part of projects where those are like underlying toes. So to just be able to see how metaphorically it's used, because I guess most people, you know, think metaphorically, they're thinking of, you know, back from their English class reading books, like, oh, this is to represent, you know, how the character was feeling at that point. A lot of people don't realize that cinema has been doing that for years when it comes to subjects, you know, and cannibalism being one of them, for that not being able to understand it. And a lot of it, like I said, stems back from most people, especially here in Western culture, you know, come from Christianity like background. So this idea of something foreign that's against kind of the norm is just great to see and being used.
Go ahead. Sorry, Ukraine. I know you. I was like, go for it, please. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting as well. Like, we look at kind of the development of the cannibal, you know, the 70s, the 80s, the Italian exploitation. You know, we've still got the Eli Roths bringing about the Green Inferno, but we're starting to see more of like almost like a Freudian view of the cannibal recently. You know, he said that cannibalism is kind of part of all of us because we start off as feeding off our mothers. And then that is developed into like our love language. And obviously this can go further into like vorophilia, consensual cannibalism, autocannibalism, etc. But I really think it's interesting now how movies are kind of representing that Freudian look. And I'm sure someone like Mary Wilde has like better insights into this. But I really like the way, for me personally, I'm obsessed with cannibalism. Like, well, I'm not a cannibal. I'm not like obsessed that way. Although, no. But like, I love the way, especially for me, it represents love. That, you know, with our mouth, we show how we love people, and that's also biting and eating. And we describe people as tasty and juicy and good enough to eat. And I just love the way that this is, like Coda said, kind of trickling down to like more this mainstream.
Like into the water, you know,
yeah.
But it blankets so many entry-level kinks and fetishes for so many people, you know, from leaving hickeys and biting and just simple things of that nature.
Yeah.
Ooh, this definitely went to a different kind of sexy place. Love it. So why don't we move on to a less sexy place and talk about our first movie of today. So Cannibal Ferox from 1981. It's part of that whole like Italian cannibal exploitation era with like Cannibal Holocaust, Man from Deep River, Eaten Alive, etc. That was like the 70s and 80s were like the prime time for those types of movies, you know, led by Umberto Lenzi, Ruggero Deodato. They're, you know, they're kind of inspired by and come from the Mondo movies from like the 60s and 70s. Lots of graphic violence, sexual assault, obviously the cannibalism, very much known for the realm of animal cruelty in a lot of these movies, but they're very much like in and of themselves this really interesting kind of subgenre of movies. And so I watched Cannibal Ferox for the first time for this, because I'm going to save Cannibal Holocaust for a different thing. But this one I hadn't seen. So I wanted to kind of challenge myself because I knew this one, like a lot of these movies, have the animal cruelty aspect of them. So I kind of usually put them at like lower bottom of my list to watch. But I was really intrigued and I did really like it. And what I thought was so interesting, and I never really thought about it in this way or maybe in these terms. And so one of our main female protagonists, she's writing this dissertation on cannibalism. And that's kind of what prompts everybody to go into the jungle to explore tribes and cannibalism, is that she's writing this dissertation about whether or not cannibalism is actually real, or was it just a myth perpetrated by colonial racists? So colonial racism and that being tied up in the whole aspect of these exploitation cannibal movies from the 70s and 80s. So I wanted to kind of bring that into the discussion today. Ukraine, you already brought it up when it comes down to the taboo nature of it. But I think this movie, well, both these movies today, I just inadvertently found this wonderful kind of theme between them. But colonial racism when it comes to cannibalism, the demonization of these othered people. So, you know what, Coda, how about we start with you when you're talking about Cannibal Ferox?
Okay, well, I have never seen the film. I wound up going through the synopsis, and I debated whether or not I was going to watch the animal cruelty part.
Yeah,
I'm one of those people that when that's a main preview point to a film, I kind of pull back, which is weird because of the types of films that I've starred in. You think it'd be open, but yeah, it's the animal stuff that gets me. So, and again, I will have to agree. A lot of it just reading over, it just seems like it's, people look at other cultures, they don't understand it. So a lot of times it's a way to, I guess, demonize a lot of that. And that was kind of the running thing that looked like it was going through. It was, coming from, First Nation peoples, Mojave Indian and Navajo. It's really easy to look historically how a lot of our culture and, you know, rituals and things that we would do have been viewed as taboo, or like, oh, this was a sign of that they were doing things like that, and it was just a clear lack of understanding when it came to those things. So it's interesting to see people actually touching on those subjects in films and pointing out and being like, hey, maybe this is just kind of a, you know, people not understanding really what they're seeing.
You agreeing?
So this was a first watch for me, even though I'm a massive Italian horror fan. I was in Rome a couple of weeks ago and had to go to Profondo Rosso. So I love Italian horror, and when you say to someone like cannibal exploitation from Italy, there's always like the ooh kind of look, you know, they think it's going to be awful. They're going to look back and be like, A, it's really bad production. B, it's probably the most offensive thing that ever existed. And yeah, I did have that kind of thought in my head, but watching it, I was really surprised about just how kind of educational this film was. You know, we've got these contrasts between the urban jungle of New York City versus the Colombian jungle. And where we see this, I think she's an anthropology student, very ill-equipped, I'm sorry. This is so ill-equipped of going into this environment. Like, what the hell? And they come across this guy, Mike, who is a drug runner from New York, bad vibes. And he's like, these, you know, people, they're cannibals, they're terrible, run while you can. But it actually turns out he is the one that's been perpetrating violence on these people. And even when we look at the difference between New York and the Colombian jungle, in New York, there are still people going around killing people with less humanity than these supposed savages, and I use savages in quote marks. And it's just such an interesting look at how, again, this kind of harks back to the Chris Columbus times of these people are savages and they kill and eat people, when in fact it's the white invaders that are doing harm. At one point, this place is called like the poisoned paradise, when in fact the only reason it's poisoned is because of this outsider coming in and doing harm to these people and their environment. So I actually really enjoyed this film.
I'm glad. I did too. I also watched Eaten Alive, which I liked a lot. And you're right. I think people will get their backs up, and like I can admit I did that too. And I put off watching, you know, movies like this, like I said, for a long time because I was just worried. I mean, the animal cruelty stuff is very unpleasant. Absolutely. As a vegan, there's frankly worse things that are happening literally at this moment all around the world. So I kind of pick and choose, you know, my battles a little bit, but they are really interesting. And most of these movies, and it comes down to, it's often these more like white Westerners coming into the jungles, like the Amazonian, there's like rainforests, or just the more like rural, like untouched landscape of nature. And they're the ones that are, you know, being violent necessarily. And they're home invasion stories, because here we are coming into their land. And of course, they're going to want to protect themselves. So I just find that whole idea of like the quote uncivilized people, of course, they're going to be from a different race, right? These indigenous communities, they're always seen as the other. They are literally on a different place. So therefore they're so deeply othered that it's, you know, it's hard not to think of them as anything else from a Western kind of point of view. We're so afraid of people that live so differently than ourselves. I found another thing interesting in this movie was a quote about violence breeds violence. Like they said this in a movie. So it's just like, you're coming into these people's homes being violent. Well, violence breeds violence. Coda, any thoughts?
No, 100% agreed. I think it's one of the more interesting subjects. The whole, you know, having people, especially like she pointed out, you know, from New York, which is widely considered in most places a, you know, like if you're not from that area, the level of violence that you could end up in is very easily. So to go into a place like a jungle where that's supposed to be the scary place, oftentimes the violence is, you know, brought over with them, and everything that is causing a lot of the problems, you know, the pollutants and things, are people coming in from an outside perspective. You know.
I think there's one thing, what I always find interesting in generalized cannibal movies is the like power dynamics that go along with it. And doing some reading about cannibalism and these movies in particular, cannibalism can be used, or like this myth of, can be used as this way to regain our own power for ourselves, like bodily autonomy, if you're looking at like movies like Raw and stuff like that, but also like with these movies, a way to exert power over another individual, often a minority or marginalized folks, like in these two movies. So how do you feel about cannibalism as this like power dynamic, Coda?
Oh, it's really interesting. Just because, having, like I said, reading over it oftentimes, I mean, I get where it's coming from. It definitely makes sense that, being able to take in someone's essence, and as well, I guess, being a victim, I guess that would be considered the worst thing that happen is literally to be devoured, nothing left alive, that this person is, breaking you down in every form possible, perpetrating the worst kind of violence upon you. So it's definitely an interesting dynamic, and it does add a really interesting layer in terms of the violence, because oftentimes you think, oh, well, what's the worst that could happen? In the film, oh, they get killed, and then you're like, no, it's worse than that, because they're literally going to devour you. You're nothing more than like, KFC for someone. So it definitely heightens the mood, and I've always found it to be an interesting subject in the sense of like literally taking in somebody's essence, because you are what you eat. That's literally what we're made from. So you're taking somebody down to build up parts of you, building blocks.
Grain, power dynamics and cannibalism.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Coda has said. And just to kind of add on it, like, yeah, when we think, like, I'm always like, I love cannibalism, it's so cool. But when I think about it, like, to be a victim of cannibalism, and especially the things I've watched, you just think like they're not killed straight away. I'm assuming, I've never met a cannibal, I cannot ask, but I assume they don't kill them straight away, that they kind of take them piece by piece. It reminds me of I think there's an episode of Criminal Minds where this person literally like seasons this person's thigh and like massages it like flipping Kobe beef or something, and then like slices it while they're still living. And just the thought of that is so disturbing. And then knowing that you're going to be eaten, like there's something a lot more than just like, it's just a bit of torture, but like it seems like that next step, that next level, and just to have that power over someone and to, I guess, reabsorb their life force, it feels like a very almost apex predator power, I guess.
Yeah, this like feeling of superiority, which we would definitely be seeing in our white Westerners coming into these more rural, exotic places. Exotic, I don't know if it's an Amazon rainforest, seems pretty exotic to me. But at the end of it, and I've seen this in other movies as well, probably Eli Roth's Green Inferno, but at the end of the movie of Cannibal Ferox, so Gloria is our anthropologist. So she was the one that was like, I need to find out if cannibalism is a myth or not. And it's all just racism. So finds out that, oh, they are actual cannibals. Okay. Are they cannibals all the time, or just cannibals because you invaded their home? That's left to be, that's kind of ambiguous. But she decided she didn't want to recount her experience as truth. She decided to be like, no, I published this. It is a myth. We're not going to talk about this. This is not a thing that exists. What are your thoughts on her kind of not revealing the truth? Ukraine?
I kind of saw it as a, middle finger up to Mike and kind of being like, you got what's coming to you. I mean, yeah, on one point we can say like, good for her, she final girled it and she's not going to be a bitch about it. But on the other side, you're kind of like, well, is this, saviorism? Is she playing the, typical female savior of this poor group of indigenous people that, need her to keep their dirty little secrets? So yeah, I guess for me, it's kind of like two halves of a scale. Yeah, it's either she's a bitch or, she's trying to play the savior. Who knows?
Yeah.
Right. And Coda, sorry, you said you read the synopsis, but did you talk? Did you talk? Did you read about the ending? Like, what are your thoughts on just hearing about that kind of ending?
I like the ambiguousness just because I do enjoy leaving it up to, quote unquote, the reader, the watcher, kind of how they feel, because it does make you think like, well, where does she lie? I mean, on one side, she's an anthropologist, so you'd think she'd want to publish the findings, but on the other side, going through that, I think some of it stems from, if you put it out there for the world, obviously it's going to attract more attention. So it's almost like is she going to be feeding into this system where you're going to be bringing in more people to end up in the same situation? So I don't know, it was a really interesting balancing act, I thought, in the end, because on one part you do want the satisfaction of like, well, why did they do this? But at the same point, some of my favorite stories are ones that are kind of just left up as to leave you wondering, like, okay, why did the character do this?
Fair. Well, let's jump into our next movie where the ending is very explicitly what it is and gives us the truth of the matter. So our next movie is Tomahawk from 2015. There's more, well, it's contemporary in the sense that it's from 2015, but it's set in the Old West era of America between 1865 to 1900. So this kind of brings us into a more North American cannibal, quote, primitive, again, lots of air quotes here today, folks, type of story. This is the time of Aboriginals seen as, quote, savages. So again, Bone Tomahawk brings up this idea of colonial racism, absolutely, this fear of the native other. And this movie is just like this wonderful slow burn. And slow burns don't usually work for me very well, but this one is so very excellent in the sense of like that the payoff is absolutely worth it. You journey with these people to the end to show that, oh, yep, they are actual cannibals. And I was reading an article about this movie, and I thought this was a kind of an interesting question that they posited, is that so cannibalism in this as like this metaphor of maybe to deflect the Westerners or white people's guilt of invasion and genocide. Is that why here we are? We're like, oh yeah, they're cannibals because we feel bad. So what are your thoughts on that? Jumping into more, again, that colonial racism in this kind of era. Ukraine?
I think Bone Tomahawk's a really interesting film. On the one hand, I enjoy it. Like you said, I'm not really a fan of slow burns, but for some reason it works for me.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's not something I can really talk on because, again, I'm a white woman, from Ireland who has our own history of colonialism, but nothing compared to like the indigenous peoples of Americas.
Yeah.
And so on first glance, I'm like, yes, this film's great. I love the gore. Like, let's talk about I love the gore.
Yeah.
However, for a 2015 film, I know it's a Western, I know it's set historically, but it still feels like it perpetuates really harmful myths about the indigenous peoples, how that they're cannibals and they're savages and they're incestuous. And look at our pretty white Christian town with all of our heterosexual couples, and we're very godly. And it just feels like they're still othering people where they don't understand their culture. That, yes, sometimes there was, they worshipped more than one deity. They weren't heterosexual. They probably weren't cis. It's just this very otherment represented by cannibalism and savagery of these indigenous people. So this film kind of gives me the ick a little bit. I don't know if I'm alone in that. There's a really good article that I read called Decolonizing Dread, Bone Tomahawk and the Misunderstanding of Cultures by Jordan Garrett. So if anyone wants to check out that article, it says it a lot more succinct than I do. But yeah, this film still kind of gives me the ick when it comes to that representation.
I would say that it's a really, really great insight and really great point, because if you even look at the movie, they go to the local expert for help, and that is a native gentleman. But there's this like disdain between everybody, and then that's really all the character does is like, oh, well, yeah, that's another what word am I looking for? Just like another group of people that you all would say are Indians because they think that we all look alike, but they, You know, it's just like he has disdain for the cops in this town, but they go to them for help, but then we never see that character again. So I absolutely understand what you're saying, Igraine. Absolutely. Coda?
Yeah, so if I remember right from the film, because I've seen it twice now, they do go to the native person, for the help. But if I remember right, he basically makes kind of a comment that they're less than the native people. That's almost like a evolved version of it. So it reminded me a lot of 13th Warrior in that aspect, where it's supposed to be, like cavemen that somehow still survive the Ice Age type thing, which is, a little bit tongue in cheek in the sense that it's like they just didn't want to go the native route because they knew how that would look, to release a film this day and age and be like, oh, it's just a bunch of, cannibalistic natives. I enjoyed the film for what it was, but it definitely, comes from a mentality of somebody who really doesn't understand, or maybe trying to understand some of the things in the film. So instead of just saying, oh, well, it's natives killing these poor white town folk, we'll just find another type of monster that even they don't like, which is just funny because within native culture there were all sorts of different tribes that were hierarchies were just looked at different. It wasn't like a group of natives would get together and say, oh, well, that tribe is just really different than us. It was completely different. So to be somebody of First Nation and watching it, it hits differently, I guess, just because of being on the other side of the fence, I guess, and being able to see how it's viewed and portrayed in that sense. Definitely was interesting. It has its moments where, it very much leaves you feeling icky because clearly why it was written and how it was done. I felt that there were certain points where they could have gone another avenue or spent a little bit more time developing certain characters to push these things, and so that's where it missed for me on stuff. I enjoy a slow burn film, so I enjoyed how slowly things kind of just built up before. It's almost like Jaws, you don't immediately see the monster. That's really what I like in a horror film, is this slow, the anticipation of when it's going to happen. So when the little bit start to happen, I was enjoying that. Again, it does get icky when they're immediately like, oh, it's these people. Okay, now that we have the native that explains it to make everybody feel good, we can get rid of him and we don't have to touch on that subject again. So that was the part that just did leave it very icky, I felt.
And again, it just
character shoot him.
Yeah, and again, I was like thinking about it. What sets off all of the action in the movie is because a bunch of these white people disturbed their actual burial ground, like their like little cemetery area. So it's like, again, is it just another home invasion story? Are they actual cannibals? It's just like, you folks invaded their space. They're becoming territorial. They're protecting their lands, protecting their people, despite what kind of unfortunateness are behind the scenes for this group of people who lives in the caves. But it's like, you all came into their area, disrupted their very sacred space, and so now they're getting, their revenge for it. So again, it also, I guess, if, correct me if I'm wrong, from what I remember, is that that's really what is taking place in this movie. So we don't really know if these people are necessarily cannibals. It's just that y'all folks came into their area, harmed them, and so they're taking up arms, right?
Yeah, I as well, like going back to the native character, I really felt they were pushing this idea of like good Indians, again in quotation marks, versus bad ones. We've got the one that seems to have integrated within this white society. They wear the same clothes. They're presented as educated, in that kind of settler fashion, versus the ones who have pushed back against that and have gone into the caves and, were pushed out of their homes originally. So now they have retreated back into the landscape. And it really feels like they were showing this clear division of what is good and what is bad Indigenous people. And then we've got the character of Bruder, played by Matthew Fox, and he's like, guess how many Indians I've killed? And you're just like, what's the point of this character's, like, I didn't quite understand why he needed to have that little, I think one of the other characters asked him, like, why do you hate them so much? And he's like, well, why don't you ask my mother and sister? And it just that felt like a really weird inclusion for me. Maybe I just missed something. But yeah, it just, like, as I said, face value, great film, great gore, the tension's amped up. But then when you start to look a bit at it, it gets my back up a little bit.
No,
Absolutely
I think
fair.
that's kind of what they wanted at times. I think it's that film that you can watch and immediately, oh, that's great. And then 10 minutes later after the film ends, you start going, wait a second, what was, So some of that's good. Like, the character that does, you mentioned, I think some of the lines are literally put in there so that you can have that moment of like, oh, you like the character, but then you have this thing where you're like, oh, well, I dislike him because he's clearly a racist. So I'm always on the fence about that because I feel like it's the quintessential kicking of the dog. It's like, oh, well, you make the bad guy by showing that he can be mean to an animal. Or you make the bad guy dislikable by showing that they're just, racist. So, I didn't. Again, some of the writing to me falls through. I really enjoyed aesthetically how the film looks visually. It's really well. But yeah, to me, I felt like the whole premise of the film was basically this is what happens when the natives go on the reservation. The world moves forward. You get great stuff, but when they go off the reservation, like this group, look what can happen. They de-evolve and become these monsters. And I remember thinking the weird thing is, if there were no settlers there to continue to eat, then how were they cannibals? Clearly the only ones they're eating are the colonizers. So
yeah. And are we going to blame them? I don't know.
characters had it coming. I mean, it's genuinely hard to like some of the characters. So.
Yeah. So now thinking about both these movies where the cannibalism aspect is actually maybe a bit more ambiguous, right? A little bit, they're kind of home invasion stories of coming into their lands and unharming them, and then they protect themselves. So, folks, would you say maybe, thinking about these two movies, that cannibalism is all part of our very entitled Western imagination? Ukraine.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I think especially when it comes to others and other cultures, there's still tourism that surrounds cannibalism in like places like Papua New Guinea. Like it's still a thing that people are like, oh, I'm gonna go to Papua New Guinea and please don't let me be eaten.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I do think a lot of it is, but at the same time, we have interest because of this true crime thing. We've got renewed interest in people like Jeffrey Dahmer and the German cannibal that met someone in a cafe and said, hey, can I eat you? So it's not really in our minds when it comes to looking at our own Western culture. So it's kind of this strange thing where it's like this unknown taboo subject, but yet very rarely do we look at our own cultures. I mean, even when we think about like white settlers, the Jamestown settlement in Virginia, they all turned to cannibalism because they ran out of food back in the day. So it's really weird how like that sort of cannibalism is almost glossed over. And the non-Western civilization cannibalism is still like, look at these terrible people. So yeah, it's a really interesting kind of dichotomy against the two cultures, and how one cannibalism is glossed over and one isn't,
or acceptable.
Yeah,
for some reason. Good point. Coda.
Yeah, I think it's easier to look at something at a distance and judge it than it is to worry about it being next door kind of mentality. And so it's because nobody likes the idea of the unknown being so close, that's what makes it unknown. And so it's easier to look at a culture or, whether culture or an area that you just don't understand. And, that's where you can lose a lot of stuff in the mysticism. You can hide a lot, you can build up these stories within that. But when it's something so close that we all know, it's easier to understand it, which I guess can be scary for a lot of people, and in the sense that it's really easy to read about a serial killer and go, oh, well, they're crazy because insert this thing that happened to them when they're young. But if it has a background similar to yours, that's much more frightening because you can go, well, how did that person who's very similar to me end up here? Like, it's not that far of a jump. So, a lot of people, you want that disconnect. It's the reason we watch, media and consume it the way that we do, because you need a break from life. And when something lay something in front of you that's so close to home, it can be jarring. It's like watching the news all the time.
Right. Before I get into the last question, I just want to put out there into the world to the folks that are watching. If you have questions for my guests, please start putting them into the chat or comment area now, and we will get to those very shortly. So my last question for you two, since we're all here because we enjoy cannibalism and cannibal films, what other movies would you recommend for people for their cannibal exploration in movies? Some of your favorites, why would you recommend them? Yagrain, why don't we start with you?
I've already mentioned a couple, but just to reiterate, Dumplings, directed by Fruit Chan, is a really interesting, different kind of cannibalistic. Obviously, not to spoil it for anyone, but the main witchy woman makes dumplings out of aborted fetuses, and it's a really interesting take on reproductive rights, bodily autonomy, getting older in a society where you're not allowed to get old.
Yeah.
Trouble every day, their deaths, which is, it wouldn't be one of my favorites, but I can see it from like a sexuality point of view, and this, like I said earlier, this kind of distinguish between love and cannibalism. I think it's a really interesting take on it. So yeah, they'd be my two recommendations.
Excellent. Coda, cannibal movie recommendations.
I touched on earlier, 13th Warrior. It was based on a book called Eaters of the Dead. It's probably one of my favorite books, and I thought, obviously the movie can't live up to it, but it did such a good job at portraying it in, covering such a wide sense of culture that, it's probably one of the movies I like to revisit yearly just because I enjoyed the book so much. So for those who haven't seen it, I highly recommend it, because it does deal in, like Viking culture and things of that sort. So it's a different portrayal for once, and so I greatly enjoyed that. The second one would have probably been one of the films that I got to be a part of that Sam Hell had done, which was either Flesh Eater X or Love Dump, either one, just because Sam had a really interesting idea behind it, and so to be a part of that project made it even more fun.
I still need to check out Flesh Eater X. It's on my list. Should just blind buy every movie you're in.
We'll have to
Love
send you a
Dump.
copy.
Oh, I would love that. I would say for myself, I haven't seen 13th Warrior, so thank you. Every time I do these panels, I have a massive to watch list if I haven't seen it already.
It's a film that gets recommended every time.
Yeah, thank you. No, that'll be great. I would say a couple of that have been popped up already, but mainly like Cannibal Holocaust, I do enjoy a lot. That's kind of a big name. I love the remake of We Are What We Are. Super like underrated, very interesting kind of like women under patriarchal rule, cannibalistic movie. Also, the side effects of eating human tissue for so long causes brain damage and issues. So it goes into that as well. And then I love Trouble Every Day. Like that's kind of like, are they cannibals? Are they vampires? Either way, we're chowing down or at least drinking some blood. I love that movie very, very much. Somebody's chiming in. Yes, Eaten Alive I watched recently to kind of prep for this cannibal episode, and I did also really enjoy that one. It brings in like cults. Anyway, so it's also really interesting in that like realm of cannibal exploitation ones. Definitely lots of warnings for the animal stuff. And so, yeah, cannibal movies are very interesting. That's kind of my last question. So let's jump into audience questions. So folks out there watching this, either on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, if you have questions for our guests, please pop them in now. Jess, I think we do have a couple of questions. I think you have a question, Jess. All right. So, what are your thoughts on the dystopian narratives with cannibalism and capitalism, like in Fresh, the movie, and the book called Tender is the New Flesh? Yagrain, what do you think?
I think it's a really interesting take. I loved the book Tender is the Flesh, and Fresh was quite fun as well. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting, again, like taking cannibalism and attributing to something that is very topical at the moment, what with unfortunately people who are billionaires who shouldn't have that much money kind of basically eating everybody else and, you know, doing us out of a lot of things. I would like to see, I mean, there could be something that is like that. I would like to see an Eat the Rich literally. It's something that really disappointed me about the menu. I was like, where's the cannibalism in this? And then realized it wasn't about cannibalism. I was very sad. Yeah, I know, right? So yeah, it's something that's very topical at the moment, and I would like to see further explored. But yeah, definitely as well an Eat the Rich. Literally, I would like to see that.
Yeah, I felt for the same thing. I was like, oh, clearly cannibalism is going to be this, and then you get through, you're like, there was no, and then you have that moment where you're like, I get it now. So I mean, it's definitely on the nose. I mean, you know, consumerism is, you know, and capitalism is probably going to be the thing that devours all of us. I mean, all of us growing up, we're all relatively close within age. We're all struggling at this point, and it's this thing where I enjoy seeing it when it's attributed to that, because again, you know, capitalism and consumers is just, it devours everything in its path, and there's not really a lot you can do about it. And it's the imminent fear of this is going to be one of the worst things that can happen to you. So I enjoyed how they went about doing it, but again, a little disappointed in the film because you're waiting for the physical metaphor of it before finally you're like, there's no cannibalism.
I definitely think it's, again, like we were talking about, that kind of the power play, the control as well, that it's gone from, you know, representing the colonialism to capitalism. And so yeah, definitely that control play is definitely at work when they're talking about cannibalism, I can't even speak, capitalism. There we go.
All right, Jess has another question. Gotta love my tech gremlin popping in because, hey, she also loves cannibalism. Do you know how many times cannibalism comes up in our conversations? A lot. So Jess has another question. What are your thoughts on the focus on women as cannibals, like in Yellow Jackets, Raw, and films or that regard? We Are remake. I throw that out because it's very underrated. So thoughts on that? Kind of like women under patriarchy, women as cannibals.
I would love to see more of it just because it doesn't happen often. And I think it's a heightened level when it is a woman in a lot of films like that, because it's that submissive, subvertive, you know, like, oh, they're supposed to be smaller, lesser than, and then to reach such, you know, taking, you know, people, because we all have this idea that we are the top of the food chain, period. So once you become prey, it's a whole different thing. And then once you become prey to something that is supposed to be small and subservient, that is even worse. So it's, you know, I love the play because it covers such a wide variety of things, of the fact that you can cover misogyny and just, you know, a wide variety of subjects within it, you know, demasculating somebody from one. So I would love to see more of that explored within films and books.
Yeah, I'd be exactly the same. I want to see some more like real dirty, non-artistic, non-pretty depictions of
none of this art has shit. That's
like
yeah.
Let's get gross. Because I think that I think that there's too many things where it almost is prettied up because it's women, and like women are gross and dirty and just want to get their teeth into something. So I'd like to see it a bit more visceral, kind of along the lines of The Woman, the Lucky McKee film that came from the original film, where the woman comes from a family of cannibals. But even grimier, like let's do it. Just it's all about taking back that power and being animalistic and not having to be this idea of what society kind of says we have to be like. So yeah, more grossness.
I can definitely get behind that. Okay, so there was another question here. Thank you, Jay Fly, from you on YouTube. Could you women or folks, let's say, could you folks eat someone if the situation called for it, such as the need to eat? Like, I'm assuming, like, could you eat human flesh if it was a survival kind of situation, like it was Yellow Jackets or Alive? We go back to the movie from, you know, the 90s.
Kind of like a Donner Party type situation.
Yes, yeah.
I think I don't know. That's always a hard question because you tell yourself that you could do these things, but until you're put into the extreme,
Yeah.
um, it's hard saying. Just because that part of me, like I mean, I joke with my partner all the time that I can eat just about anything here, like whatever they want. Like I'll eat stuff I don't even like just because that's my brain is wired that way. Like here's food in front of you,
You
eat it, and a lot of that just stems from growing up a lower income family where your parents are going to make it and you're just going to eat what you eat. So now as an adult I've just gotten in the habit of like, I'm not a fan of this, but whatever, we're going to eat it anyways. So I tell myself I probably could, because survival really is a driving force on a lot of things. And having come from a background like in combat sports where you do go on these massive weight cuts and things like that, like I remember doing things where I would be eating a single bite of chicken every hour while I was doing a weight cut, watching the Food Network and stuff that I would never ever be interested in, become salivating because you're just so deprived of nutrients and you can't think. So you're just watching this stuff and you're like, I would never eat that on a regular thing, but like you'd be watching soap commercials, you're like, that looks so good because you're just so hungry.
Ukraine? Cannibalism?
Look, listen. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious. No, if you've ever seen Hannibal, you're like, that looks good. No, I guess like if I was in like a really extreme situation, I can't say I wouldn't. But then again, knowing my luck, I'd probably be the one to be eaten, to be honest. So
I think that's where most of us fall into. It's like we tell ourselves we're going to be the one to eat somebody. It's like chances are we're going to be the one taken out within the first 40 minutes of the film.
I will confidently say, even as a vegan, absolutely, I would. I mean, it's about survival, right? Anyway, so excellent. So I think that's it for all of our questions. We're getting to our 1 hour mark. So I think that's pretty much it. What are we saying? Yeah, let's embrace our natural side. Excellent. Okay. So we're going to wrap this up. Y'all have busy lives. So thank you to everybody who was watching. Thank you to my wonderful guests today, Ukraine and Coda. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you to Jessica, my co-host, my tech gremlin behind the scenes. I hope to see you all back here today at 4 p.m. Eastern time for the next panel on Extreme Essentials, the August Underground Trilogy. Stay grim, folks. Stay grim. See you later.